remember exactly the sound of glasses clinking in that hall, lit by crystal chandeliers. High up in a building in Manhattan, where the wind outside was as cold as the eyes of the people around me. I had been invited to that corporate event as a formality. The Brazilian subsidiary had closed $1 million deal, and it was only fair that I, the director of operations, would come to represent our team. But from the moment I opened my mouth to thank them for the opportunity, I noticed the laughter contained in the corners of the lips of some American executives. My strong accent, full of rolled R's and open vowels, was like an invitation to mockery. I tried to continue, talking about the projections for the next quarter, but I heard throat clearing, forced coughs, and even small muffled guffaws. A man in a navy blue suit, with a gold pin on his lapel, even repeated one of my phrases, exaggerating my accent in a caricatured tone, drawing laughter from a group nearby. My face burned. It was as if I were naked, exposed, vulnerable, in front of predators who could smell insecurity. They didn't care that I had tripled the revenue of our Latin American unit. To them, I was just the nice little Brazilian who spoke funny. When the host of the event took back the microphone, I felt an almost childish relief at no longer being the center of attention, but the damage had already been done. The whispered jokes continued, and the worst was yet to come. Because that night, something was planted inside me. A burning desire, which would start small, almost imperceptible, but which would soon grow until it took over my every thought. I would make them bitterly regret having laughed at me. What they didn't know was that, by mocking my accent, they had lit the spark of a silent revenge that would cost them much more than simple embarrassment. It would cost them millions, and the prestige they so proudly held. The morning after the event, I woke up in my hotel room with the bitter taste of humiliation still stuck to my tongue. I could feel my blood pounding in my ears whenever I remembered the joking tone of those men, who were reproducing my accent as if it were a catchphrase from some cheap show. I got up, looked out the window, and saw New York waking up, cars, horns, people rushing about, with no idea of what had happened the night before. Downstairs, everything was normal, but inside me, something was distorted. I no longer wanted to be just the hard-working Latino executive who overcame language barriers. I wanted to be feared, or at least respected, to the point that no one would even dare laugh when they heard my voice. I spent the day in meetings and lunches, pretending to be normal. I smiled, nodded, and showed graphs and charts as if it were just another step in our expansion process. But my mind worked in the background, building a silent web that I barely fully understood. I only knew that it was driven by the hunger to make amends for the affront. When I returned to Brazil, I carried not only signed contracts, but also a mental list of those who had mocked me, and the vulnerable sectors they represented. Those were long but meticulous weeks. I began to cross-reference data that no one else had the patience to analyze, studying American operations in such obscure detail that they were not even included in standard management reports. I discovered, for example, that the director with the gold brooch was indirectly responsible for an accounting flow that masked gigantic administrative expenses. Meanwhile, the man in the gray suit who had laughed too loudly managed logistics partnerships whose contracts were expiring and would soon be renegotiated. Without any clause protecting against aggressive competition, every laugh that night now had a CPF, a corporate email, a password to internal systems that I could still access because of the cross-collaboration invitations. I made a point of keeping a friendly smile in all the exchanges. I was the friendly Latino, always willing to help, the one who spoke funny but made up for it with friendliness. And that's precisely why no one suspected when I asked for extra reports, or small authorizations that, added together, gave me an almost complete view of areas that weren't mine by contract. When I had everything I needed, I invited a Canadian investor who had been flirting with our market for years to a discreet dinner. He didn't speak Portuguese, but he loved Brazil and even more, so the chance to make a big splash in the sector in which our company operated. I showed him scenarios, projections, and finally a proposal for the silent acquisition of specific assets. It wasn't a sale of our subsidiary. It was something more ingenious. We would sell part of the operations that supported the supply of the American parent company, but in such a segmented way that no one would notice until it was too late. The investor smiled like an old fox, understood the game, and agreed to invest an almost obscene amount of capital. In the meantime, I continued to send quiet reports to New York, strategically omitting every small movement that might sound a warning. When the deal was closed, the paperwork followed a tortuous trail through holding companies and funds, so that the Canadian investor's name would only appear much later. In the short term, it seemed like just a local restructuring to optimize taxes. In the medium term, it meant that the American parent company was just a few months away from losing crucial contracts, key suppliers, and much of the indirect cash flow that had always kept the balance sheet comfortable. The day came when everything began to fall apart. I was on a video conference call with the same executives who had laughed at me that night. The CEO with the gold pin seemed calm, talking about the expansion to the West Coast, while I just waited, controlling every beat of my heart. Then the CFO abruptly entered the virtual room, his face pale, his voice trembling. He informed me that they had received simultaneous notices of termination of logistics contracts. And on top of that, a partner bank had refused to extend a crucial line of credit. The silence that followed was thick, almost palpable. For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. The man in the gray suit tried to mumble something about contingencies. But the truth was that there was no contingency against what I had done. They depended on us more than they would ever admit, and now they were on the ropes. I remained motionless, listening, feigning surprise, occasionally saying this is serious or we need to look into it, while inside I savored every second of their agony like a rare wine. In the following weeks, the stock market penalized the parent company's shares. Investors began to question its governance, and soon the entire market realized that the giant was not on such solid legs. There were mass layoffs, labor lawsuits, and the brand's image was almost irreversibly damaged. But the best moment for me was a month later, at an international symposium, on a different stage with a different microphone. I was invited to speak about corporate restructuring in Latin America. I spoke slowly, with the same strong accent as always, without trying to soften anything. Some American executives were there, watching me with wide eyes perhaps. They were afraid of what I would do next. But I concluded with a restrained smile. It's funny how underestimating someone because of their way of speaking can cost you dearly. Very dearly. There was applause. I don't know if it was out of politeness or fear. When I left the stage, I felt like I had closed a cycle. They would never laugh at my accent again. And, in a way, perhaps I had indeed become the silent monster they feared at the first sign of difference. After that symposium, something curious began to happen. I received invitations from other multinationals to speak, to be part of advisory boards, and even to lead executive mentoring programs focused on emerging markets. It was as if the same accent that had previously been a source of ridicule was now interpreted as an exotic sign of boldness, courage, and global vision. I accepted some of these invitations, but with the calculated distance of someone who never forgets those who tried to humiliate him. In the hallways of the large hotels where these events were held, I noticed different looks. They were no longer contained chuckles, but expressions of caution, some even of frank fear. Some people whispered my name with a certain fear, as if it were dangerous to upset me. And perhaps it was. The curious thing is that I didn't need to raise my voice to intimidate anyone. My track record spoke for me, and each word uttered in my thick accent now seemed to resonate louder than any impeccable English. Inside, however, I carried something that I didn't easily admit even to myself. It was an almost uncomfortable emptiness, a hole that no corporate victory seemed to fill. For years, my motivation had been to prove that they couldn't walk all over me with impunity, that mocking my way of speaking would cost them dearly. I had proven this so convincingly that I had changed the entire board. But what came next? I would wake up in the middle of the night with memories of that ballroom in New York, of the sound of laughter echoing against the glass, of the heat rising up my neck. I relived it not with pain, but with a strange bittersweet pleasure, as if each past humiliation were an inverted trophy that justified what I had done later. Still, no matter how much I contemplated these thoughts, I had to move on. I began to dedicate part of my time to visiting smaller operations of the company in the interior of Brazil, helping local managers structure processes that might one day prevent other young people with small-town accents from suffering the same mockery that I had endured. It was almost a project of silent redemption, even if I would never openly admit it. But fate has cruel ways of testing whether we have truly healed our wounds. On one of these visits, I received an urgent email from the European headquarters, informing me that a new consortium was interested in acquiring a majority stake not only in our Latin arm, but in the entire global structure of the company. It was an aggressive consolidation move, promising monstrous synergies, drastic cost cuts, and a unification of corporate culture that, I knew well, would end with executives with uniform accents and behaviors, with no room for dissenting voices. What caught me off guard was who was leading this consortium. the same director with the gold brooch, who had transferred to an international fund shortly after the partial collapse of the old company. The man now appeared no longer as an executive, but as an investor, leading a group that intended to absorb what was left of the company where I had built my revenge. It was as if the past had come knocking on the door, not apologizing, but demanding entry, ready to reclaim what I had taken. I was called to a meeting in Zurich to negotiate the terms of this potential merger. The meeting room on the 37th floor of a minimalist building had giant windows that looked out over the Alps in the distance. The light came in cold, almost bluish, contrasting with the nervousness that hung over the room. When the former director entered, dressed in an impeccable light gray suit, our eyes met for a second that seemed to last hours. He smiled, not the jocular smile of years before, but a calculated smile, as if he were recognizing a worthy adversary. We shook hands. His English sounded more polished than ever, and, curiously, I noticed that he tried hard not to let any tone of superiority show. Perhaps he had learned the hard way that underestimating accents was costly. Still, the game was far from over. The man explained the consortium's plan in impressive technical detail, talking about economies of scale, tax synergies, and governance gains that sounded irrefutable on paper. For hours I listened, asked specific questions, and wrote down each answer. Not out of insecurity, but to save time, to map out their expressions. Their small shifts in their gaze that revealed to me where the weak points of the proposal were. At the end of the meeting, I asked for a few days to analyze everything. I returned to the hotel with the weight of that possible capitulation on my shoulders. I knew that if we accepted, we would lose much of the autonomy that had allowed us to maneuver against them in the past. But I also knew that refusing would mean facing months, perhaps years, of corporate warfare that would drain our coffers and our energy. I spent that night awake, revisiting documents, calling lawyers and strategists, trying to find a loophole that would give me an advantage without repeating the methods of the past. Because, despite the dark hole that still lived inside me, I was not willing to destroy the company just to beat his ego again. The next morning, over a bitter coffee watching the snow fall outside, I had an idea that could turn the tables in a more elegant way. I decided that I would propose a partial merger, but with governance clauses that would guarantee me a permanent seat on the global board and a veto over any decision that directly affected our Latin American operations. It would be a way of keeping alive the essence of what I had built, while swallowing, for strategic convenience, part of the pride that still corroded me. When we sat down again face to face, 2 days later, I laid out my counterproposal in the same heavy voice that had once made them laugh. I looked him straight in the eye, unblinking, letting each heavy syllable fall onto the table like small stones. The former director took a deep breath, looked at his lawyers, and then, in an almost imperceptible gesture, nodded. I knew that, even with the financial power of the consortium, I could not afford a prolonged war without exposing weaknesses that I knew all too well. We sealed the deal right there. As we signed the papers, I felt something almost like peace. It was not an absolute victory, nor was it a defeat. It was an unstable balance, but enough to ensure that, at least for now, no one would ever laugh at the way I spoke again. As I left the building, I walked through the icy streets of Zurich, feeling the wind blow against my face, remembering the chandeliers in Manhattan, the laughter, the heat rising on the back of my neck, and I realized that, despite everything, I still carried the same strong, irreducible accent, as ingrained in me as the blood that pumped my heart. Back in Brazil, I tried to get back into a routine that no longer belonged to me. The daily meetings with regional managers, the performance indicator analysis, the presentations to minority shareholders, all of that seemed pale after the international power games that had consumed me in recent years. Even so, I maintained an almost military discipline to fulfill each commitment with precision, as if it were the only way to keep my own spirit from losing itself in vanity. For weeks, everything went on at a predictable pace, until the day when an unmarked email arrived in my inbox. It was an invitation to participate in an academic panel on cultural diversity in corporate environments, signed by a professor from a mid-sized American university. It was probably sent to dozens of executives from non-English-speaking countries to give the event an international feel. In other times, I would have ignored it completely. But there was something in that title, the importance of accents for global innovation, that hooked me. Maybe it was just morbid curiosity. Maybe it was a hidden desire to revisit my ghosts on controlled ground. I accepted. The event was modest, held on an old campus in the Midwest of the United States, with an audience composed mostly of students, a few academics, and a few market professionals. There were no cameras broadcasting live to billions of devices around the world, nor journalists eager to report on any explosive phrase. Still, when I took the microphone, I felt the same uncomfortable vibration in my chest that I had felt years before. On the night of the chandeliers in Manhattan, I began to speak, recounting my journey with calculated frankness, omitting the most sordid details, but not hiding the essence of what had happened. I spoke of the laughter, the embarrassment, the desire for revenge that had crystallized in decisions capable of moving millions of dollars and destroying careers. I also spoke of the melancholic relief in realizing that, even after all the victories, I still carried the weight of each laugh. The auditorium fell silent. Some students were taking notes diligently, others were looking at me with confused expressions, as if trying to decide whether I was a hero, an anti-hero, or just a dangerous man who happened to decide to speak the truth. At the end, a young woman raised her hand. She had very fair skin, freckles, and red hair tied back in a messy bun. She asked, almost shyly, what I would have done if that night, years ago, in New York, no one had laughed at my accent. If they had listened to me with genuine respect. I was speechless for a moment. The question, simple and almost childish, cut deeper than all the market analyses, audits, or governance reports I had ever read in my life. What would I have done? Would I have been just another foreign executive trying to adapt? Trying to reduce my accent? Taking phonetics classes to sound more neutral? Perhaps slowly erasing myself until I was indistinguishable from any other average manager? Would he never have felt the need to dig so deep into the company's underbelly? To expose flaws? To engineer hostile takeovers and devious alliances? Maybe my ambition would have remained confined to annual bonuses and beach houses instead of turning into a predatory instinct. I gave her a sad half-smile and said that he would probably have been a much lighter man but also a much less interesting one. She jotted this down in her notebook like someone who had just unearthed a rare pearl, though to me it sounded like an epitaph in advance. After that talk, something in me began to give way. It wasn't regret, nor was it redemption. It was more like the realization that certain battles, even when won, leave scars that never heal. I continued to lead the company with the same rigor, closed new contracts, participated in investment rounds, and consolidated joint ventures in countries I could barely identify on the map. On the outside, my prestige only grew. I received weekly invitations to join the boards of directors of global giants, and some newspapers named me as one of the most influential names in Latin American capitalism. But at night, alone in the office, I would find myself reading old reports, revisiting archived emails, almost like someone picking at a wound to make sure it still hurt. It wasn't nostalgia for the moment of revenge itself, but an obsession with the turning point, the exact moment when seemingly harmless laughter changed the course of so many lives. It was one of those early mornings that I decided to revisit Manhattan. Not for business, not to close mergers or give lectures, but simply to walk the streets where everything had begun to unfold. I stayed at the same hotel as the fateful event, asked for the same room if it was available, and to my surprise, it was. When I walked in, I smelled the familiar smell of carpet mixed with industrial cleaning products. I looked out the window. There was the city, pulsing with the same arrogant indifference as always. I went out to walk aimlessly, passing storefronts, crowded restaurants, taxi drivers arguing in languages that intertwined like loose threads. At a certain point, I found myself in front of the same building where the corporate event that had changed everything had taken place. Now there was a sign announcing that part of the space was available for rent. The lobby seemed more modest, the crowds were smaller. I went in and walked to the ballroom that night had been packed with executives laughing at inside jokes. It was empty, the lights off, chairs piled up in a corner. I stood there for long minutes, listening only to the distant sound of traffic. No laughter echoed. It was just a cold, ordinary room, like so many others. There, finally, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Not because I had forgiven anyone or because the scars had disappeared, but because I realized that true strength did not lie in the act of revenge, but in continuing to exist, intact, despite everything. My accent was still strong as it had been that first night. But now it was no longer a stigma. It was the mark of someone who had survived, triumphed, and, above all, remained true to their own voice no matter how many millions were at stake, how many faces contorted in contempt, or how many empty applause tried to mask fear. After that almost funereal return to the Manhattan salon, I decided to extend my stay in the United States for a few days, driven by an impulse that even I didn't understand. I walked through neighborhoods that had once intimidated me, sat in crowded cafes where I overheard conversations in dozens of languages, and observed the elegant indifference of New Yorkers rushing to appointments they might have considered vital. For the first time in years, I felt invisible, and this didn't bring me anxiety, but rather a certain relief. No badges, no formal introductions, no pressure to demonstrate power or command respect through graphs and projections. I was just another foreign face, carrying with me an accent that went unnoticed amid the global cacophony that the city had always been. At night, I would return to the hotel and watch the traffic through the large windows of my room, reflecting on the winding path that had brought me there. I wondered what I would say to the insecure young executive who had once walked those same red carpets, fearing laughter that had indeed come. Perhaps I would tell him to cultivate the courage to remain whole, without the need to become a predator just to avoid being prey. Perhaps I would say nothing, because I understood that each wound had been crucial in shaping the outcome, no matter how painful it had been. A few days later, almost ready to return to Brazil, I received an unexpected call from the chairman of the global board, an experienced man, with decades of experience in the halls of Davos, Tokyo, and London, speaking polished English that seemed tailor-made for the corridors of the world's largest stock exchanges. He was in New York for private meetings with investors and suggested we meet. I accepted, not out of deference, but out of curiosity to know what was driving this sudden contact. We met in a discreet restaurant, far from the main avenues, lit by amber lamps that cast calm shadows on the walls. He got straight to the point. He wanted to sound me out for a global position, a position that would give me strategic oversight not only over Latin America, but also over critical operations in the United States, Europe, and Asia. The reason was not explicitly stated, but I could read between the lines. My reputation, built by force, intimidated rivals, and neutralized behind-the-scenes hostilities. In addition to guaranteeing respect for markets that previously dismissed our culture as a tropical eccentricity, the board wanted my influence to contain the internal disputes that had begun to corrode the conglomerate after the latest mergers. It was the formal consecration of everything I had accomplished, the definitive seal of global power. However, I accepted the invitation with a coolness that perhaps surprised him. There was no longer that breathless glow of someone seeking to prove something at any cost. I knew exactly what that chair represented, not only influence over billions in assets and thousands of jobs, but also monumental loneliness, the need to keep knives hidden while smiling at cocktail parties, to anticipate betrayals even from allies who swore loyalty. I gave my affirmative answer, however, already aware that it would not bring the same adrenaline as in the past. It was, rather, a natural extension of someone who had become indispensable precisely because he refused to be completely domesticated. At the end of dinner, when we went out into the biting cold of the sidewalk, he put his hand on my shoulder and said with almost paternal gentleness that he admired my tenacity, especially since I had never worried about hiding my way of speaking. I responded with only a restrained nod, because I was no longer interested in disguised compliments. The night went on without a party, without a toast, without a celebration. I walked back to the hotel, reflecting on how even the most resounding victories can sound silent within those who carry them. A few weeks later, having been reinstated in Brazil but now with formalized global authority, I began to reorganize entire teams, replacing directors who were relying on old vices, implementing transparent processes that undermined internal cartels that lived off shady contracts. It was not a move motivated by pure ethics. It was above all about consolidating the empire that had been entrusted to me, eliminating loopholes that could be used against me in the future, just as I had done with those who had laughed at my accent years ago. I then realized the cycle was repeating itself. Young executives would come to me with wide-eyed, fearful eyes, worried about stumbling over the wrong syllables that could suggest a lack of sophistication. Some even disguised their own regional accents, polishing words until they lost their identity. And that caused me an almost physical discomfort. I did not want to become the executioner I had once faced, but I was also not willing to give up the austerity that guaranteed the stability of the business. That was when I created an internal executive training program, explicitly encouraging each manager to keep their cultural traits intact. I made a point of speaking in person at the launch, speaking in Portuguese full of robust R's and an almost sing-song rhythm, observing the relieved expressions of those there who understood that they didn't need to mutilate themselves to fit into an imported standard. Even so, no matter how hard I tried to balance rigor and encouragement, I knew that my name carried an aura of fear that no one dared to question out loud. I had become the specter that haunted boardrooms simply because I could allocate or withdraw millions of dollars with an email. And paradoxically, the memory of past laughter remained alive, as a permanent reminder of why I could never completely relax. In the sleepless nights, reviewing reports or answering encrypted messages from consultants who were scouting mergers in Korea or the south of France, I wondered if all that monumental machinery still turned on the same primitive engine as it had in the beginning. The need to prove that no one would have the right to laugh with impunity at my accent. Maybe it did. Maybe every decision I made, every contract I closed, every painting I knocked down, was a direct result of that first wound. And realizing this did not bring me comfort, only the cold confirmation that certain pains become DNA, shaping not only what we do, but who we are in essence. The years passed, and with them the weight of responsibility grew in proportion to the empire I had helped to consolidate. The conglomerate had become a colossal entity, present in more than 40 countries, supported by logistics chains so complex that even its top executives had only partial glimpses of the whole. I, however, kept eyes and ears on every end. I hired external auditors with impeccable reputations, created redundant compliance systems, and financed business intelligence teams that monitored competitors and partners with the same paranoid zeal with which other men guard the doors of their homes. All to ensure that the power I had achieved with so much effort, driven by past humiliations, would never be corroded from within as I had done to my adversaries in the past. The irony was not lost on me. I had become what I had once feared and hated, the silent force that watches mercilessly, ready to crush any threat that arose, even if it came wrapped in smiles or friendly invitations to long lunches in haute cuisine restaurants. But there was another side to all this, a side that was perhaps crueler than all the corporate strategies. On the rare days off I had, I would travel alone to unlikely places, far from the financial capitals, where no one cared about the price of oil or the fluctuations in the euro-dollar exchange rate. In small coastal towns, I would sit in modest bars, drink local beers, and listen to stories from fishermen, innkeepers, mechanics, who spoke with accents as strong as mine, although they carried different inflections, different pains. In these conversations, the topic of work would sometimes come up, but almost always in a tone of resignation, not as an arena of power. I would listen attentively, absorbing the brutal simplicity of those who live without having to manipulate boards of directors or shareholder charts. There was a purity in these encounters that made me question whether the entire labyrinth I had built was nothing more than a monumental trap for myself. At night, lying in hard beds in cheap hotels, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I would have been happier remaining a random regional manager, managing finite spreadsheets, never tasting the bitter corporate blood that had so nourished me. These thoughts became more frequent when I received the news of the death of the former director of the Gold Brooch, that same man who had first laughed at my accent, setting off the chain reaction that would drag us all to such unlikely fates. He died quietly, in a Swiss hospital, victim of an aggressive cancer that consumed his bones in a matter of months. The news reached me through a brief report of institutional relations, which listed deaths and retirements of important figures in the market. I felt something strange when I read his name. It was not relief, nor joy, much less pity. It was as if an invisible pillar had been removed from the foundation of my own story. He had been the perfect antagonist, the catalyst for the silent fury that turned me into a financial predator, and now it was gone. I spent days restless, unable to fully concentrate on important mergers that were in an advanced stage. I had recurring nightmares of dark ballrooms, filled with mocking voices that echoed without an owner. I woke up sweating, panting, feeling the metallic taste of the old adrenaline that had driven me through each brutal play. It was during this period that I decided to reorganize part of the group's assets, anticipating a global consolidation movement that could put us even more at the center of the board. Some people saw this as just another cold maneuver, but deep down there was a visceral component. I needed to fill the void left by that man's death. Without him, without his shadow hanging over my memories, all that was left was the sound of my own accent reverberating in silent rooms, reminding me that the entire empire I had built was also an attempt to stifle old laughter. I launched an aggressive offensive against competitors in Asia and Africa, buying strategic stakes in companies that would never have imagined arousing the interest of such a distant conglomerate. I was relentless, as if I were searching for a new nemesis, someone to take the symbolic place of the former director. But no one seemed worthy of this role. The few who dared to put up small barriers were soon crushed by our overwhelming liquidity and the legal maze that my teams knew how to set up like no one else. In the midst of these events, I was invited to a private dinner in Houston, organized by an investment bank that brokered some of the acquisitions. The room was luxurious, decorated with works by contemporary artists, and there was a soft orchestra playing jazz in a corner. Everything seemed set up to remind those present that they were among the masters of the world. During the event, a young analyst approached me. He must have been in his early 20s, wearing an ill-fitting suit, and sweat visible on his neck. He began by praising some of my articles published in business magazines, then ventured a comment about my ability to maintain regional culture even while holding a global position. Finally, unexpectedly, he confessed that he had always been ashamed of his own Texan accent, so thick that he sometimes avoided speaking at international conferences so as not to be seen as rustic. Hearing that, I felt a strange pang, perhaps compassion, perhaps just a reflection of my past manifesting itself. I put my hand on his shoulder and said, in a dry but honest tone, that it was precisely my accent that had brought me here. He smiled, a relieved smile that seemed to have been waiting years to happen, and thanked me in an almost childlike whisper. I left that dinner with a heavy head. I walked alone through the streets of Houston until the wee hours, ignoring the driver who was waiting for me. I needed this isolation to think. I began to understand that my story was no longer just mine. It had become a corporate myth repeated in business schools, seminars and articles, inspiring young people with different accents to believe that they could get where they wanted without mutilating their origins. This should have given me some pride, but deep down, it caused me an almost melancholic discomfort, because I knew exactly the price it exacted. I knew how many friends I had lost, how many relationships I had destroyed, how many nights I had found myself locked in foreign offices, negotiating with men who would gladly eat me alive if they saw the slightest loophole. All this sacrifice so that, in the end, I would be held up as an example of triumphant authenticity. The irony was too brutal to savor. When I got back to the hotel, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the dark ceiling, feeling my heart beat at a rhythm that no longer had the same strength as it had years ago. I thought about the director with the gold brooch. I thought about the young Texan. I thought about myself, newly arrived in Manhattan so many years before, holding a glass of cheap champagne with trembling hands. I concluded that perhaps the true victory was not to have built an empire to silence laughter, but to continue speaking my own way, despite all of it. And it had seemed impossible. I continued to manage acquisitions, close strategic deals, and protect our interests in turbulent markets. But I began to adopt a rhythm that allowed me, for the first time in decades, to breathe. I began to arrive home at less indecent hours, to eat dinner without my cell phone on the table, to walk in the garden without headphones in my ears, transmitting reports or confidential calls. I was still the same executive whose presence in any meeting was enough to change contractual clauses and make lawyers from multinationals squirm in search of loopholes. But something in my gaze had changed. It was no longer the insatiable hunger to prove a point. It was a kind of armed peace, the state in which one lives after fighting such long battles that the body no longer remembers what it is like to be completely relaxed, but it also no longer vibrates at the smell of blood. Some might call it maturity. I would not dare give such a simple name to a process that cost me so much. Yet every now and then, my old nature would reawaken. All it took was a sly email from a competitor trying to maneuver in the shadows, or a rumor of a hostile merger that would jeopardize the foundations of the conglomerate, and I would once again become the cool-headed creature who studied organizational charts like a trench map. Once, a Middle Eastern investment fund tried to approach one of our critical suppliers, dangling generous promises of capital to gain indirect control of a vital supply chain. When I heard about it, I called meetings that lasted until dawn, redrawn contracts in a matter of hours, and sent our top legal officers on planes to 3 different continents to wage a silent war of documents and preferential clauses. By the end of that week, the fund had backed down, issuing a tepid statement that spoke of a strategic realignment of priorities. I read the note sitting in my living room, the evening light streaming through the blinds, and I felt something akin to satisfaction, not out of pure corporate sadism, but because protecting what I had built, with sweat, sleepless nights, and an accent that almost cost me my future, had become a mission as vital as breathing. However, in the moments when the phone stopped ringing and the reports stopped coming in floods, I found myself thinking about the many versions of myself that had been lost along the way. I remembered the ambitious young man who had landed in New York thinking that competence was enough to be accepted. I remembered the hurt man who, upon hearing the first laughs, silently swore that he would destroy each and every one of those smiles, even if to do so he had to dismantle the entire structure that supported his tormentors. I also remembered the clinical predator I had become, capable of decimating careers with a spreadsheet and a nod, driven by an almost irrational desire to ensure that no one would ever dare to belittle my way of speaking again. And now, sitting in my leather chair, surrounded by screens displaying world indexes, digital contracts awaiting signature and reports arriving translated from several languages, I wondered what was left of all of them. Perhaps it was just a disjointed mosaic, made up of pieces of these men, sustaining the persona that the corporate world knew as the embodiment of rigor and international success. It was one morning, while I was reviewing an investment prospectus in Indonesia, that I received a call from a renowned Brazilian university. They wanted to invite me to be honored at an event about national leaders who had achieved global influence, without losing their cultural roots. The program coordinator explained to me that he saw in me the perfect example of someone who had remained genuine, who had not bowed to cosmopolitan uniformities in order to be accepted in the circles that command global finance. The irony was so blatant that I had to suppress the urge to laugh out loud. I thought about refusing immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps a perverse desire to challenge my own caricature. I accepted, agreeing to participate without pomp, asking that they dispense with embarrassing ceremonies or laudatory videos. They readily agreed, happy just to have me there. On the day of the event, I was greeted by a packed audience of business, economics, and law students. Young, attentive faces stared at me as if I were a sphinx capable of revealing the secret to victory in the brutal world of corporations. They spoke of my achievements, of how I had overcome linguistic and regional prejudices, of my unshakable authenticity. And then they handed me the microphone. I took a deep breath, held it for a few moments and, in an impulse that surprised even me, I told the full story. Not the polished version, not the inspiring tale of keeping one's accent as a symbol of pride. I told them about the sleepless nights I spent planning layoffs, about the cold strategies that ruined entire companies just to strengthen our position, about how the fear of being ridiculed turned into a devouring machine that spared nothing in its path. I even told them about the emptiness that haunts me to this day. The same emptiness that not all the astronomical bonuses or headlines in international magazines were able to fill. When I finished, the auditorium was completely silent. Some were looking at the floor, others were staring at me with expressions somewhere between shock and admiration. There was no immediate applause, and that was almost liberating. For once, I didn't feel like I was being held in a gilded frame to satisfy uplifting narratives. After the lecture, a professor approached me. Her eyes were tired, probably after years of dealing with academic bureaucracy and scattered classes. She said that I had been brave in exposing the raw truth, but that perhaps it was dangerous for my image. I smiled, not out of contempt, but because I finally understood that there was no image more honest than the one I had just presented. The man who had once feared being humiliated because of his accent had become a giant who could have swallowed the entire market. But in the end, he remained carrying the same sound of voice, the same nasal cadence that so many found laughable. And it was precisely there, in what they wanted to ridicule, that my most intimate victory lay. Not because I had defeated enemies or consolidated fortunes, but because, despite everything, I never needed to polish my essence to fit in on stages that were not made for me. When I left that auditorium, late in the afternoon, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift a little. There were still deals to be made, meetings to be led, acquisitions to be planned. You would undoubtedly continue to be the same ruthless strategist, because the market offers no mercy to those who loosen their grip. But something inside me had settled down. The young man who had once blushed with shame when he heard foreign executives laugh was now walking with firm steps. Not because he had billion-dollar contracts in his pocket, but because he knew that he had never stopped speaking his own way, and that, in the end, this was the greatest act of rebellion he could have committed in a world that insists on molding everyone to the same tone. The following months passed at an almost solemn pace, as if everything around me were adjusting to a new frequency after that public confession I had made at university. I still presided over tense meetings where contracts worth hundreds of millions were decided in microscopic detail. And I was still invited to international conferences where CEOs of rival conglomerates lined up to hear me speak about the future of emerging markets. But something in my demeanor had imperceptibly changed. I no longer felt the need to enter rooms with authority like a shield. It simply accompanied me, silently, solidified by years of history, by moves that no one else would even dare to plan. My words, heavy with the same accent that had once provoked laughter, were now followed with reverence. As if each inflection were a cipher code revealing the secret of global domination. And this was not just because of me. It was also the product of a world that, although still deeply addicted to prejudice, was beginning to understand that peripheral voices could be the very voice of the future. At one of these international meetings, held in Singapore, I came across a curious panel on artificial intelligence and linguistic regionalisms. Experts were discussing how algorithms trained on predominantly English-speaking databases reproduced subtle biases, treating accent variations as noise to be corrected. I watched silently, almost amused, as engineers with polished voices tried to justify the technical bias with colorful graphs. At the end, one of them recognized me in the audience and asked my opinion. I stood up, adjusted the microphone and said, in broken English, that perhaps the problem was not the algorithm, but what it reflected in human nature, the visceral fear of difference, the ancestral need to standardize in order to feel safe. I added that one day they also tried to correct me, to prune my open vowels, to tame my hard consonants, and that if I had allowed it, they would not be there listening to me today. The room went silent. The moderator, visibly uncomfortable, quickly moved on to the next topic, but I saw a spark of something like relief in the eyes of some young technicians, as if they had heard tacit permission not to completely bow down to the pasteurized sound that the market demanded. Back in Brazil, I resumed the habit of visiting operations in small towns, not just to supervise processes or pressure managers, but because I needed to feel the real pulse of what we were building. In a certain town in the interior of the Northeast, I was greeted nervously by a group of employees who seemed to fear that every word they said could cost them their jobs. I struck up a conversation with a young man who offered me coffee in a simple plastic cup. I asked him where he was from, and he proudly replied with the name of a district I had never heard of. I asked if he liked working there, and he stammered, looking at the ground, then said yes. That it was better than working in the fields like his parents. I recognized in that speech a trace of the same embarrassment that had haunted me for years. I sat down next to him and asked him to tell me about his family. And little by little the nervousness gave way to colorful stories about bean plantations, local festivals, the first time he had ridden a donkey. When he finished, he smiled shyly but genuinely, and something in that simplicity struck me. I patted him on the shoulder and told him to never be ashamed of the way he spoke, because the world outside was increasingly filled with identical, empty voices. He didn't seem to understand completely, but he nodded vigorously, as if registering something important, even without fully deciphering it. On the way back to the airport, I reflected on how my trajectory had not been just a personal story. Whether I liked it or not, I had become a symbol for people like that young man, people who, in other times, might have been taught to keep quiet, to disguise their origins, to contort themselves to fit into imported molds. There was no poetry in that. It was just the harsh realization that the corporate world, despite being modern, still operated under the same tribal rules as always. Those who hold power shape the standard, and the rest conform or perish. I had simply turned the tables, using the power I had gained to protect my way of being. Even so, I knew that this was not enough to change the logic of the market. Hundreds of young people like that would continue to feel their throats tighten before opening their mouths in a meeting, fearing that their accent would reveal vulnerabilities. And perhaps it was precisely this collective fear that guaranteed me so much space, because all I had to do was speak for them to understand that this was not a mistake to be corrected, but a trait of strength. On another occasion, I was invited to a delicate negotiation in Germany. The objective was to form a logistics consortium involving ports and strategic roads, an ambitious project that brought together governments and multinationals. During the negotiations, I noticed that some local executives were trying to test me with veiled irony, making jokes in German, thinking that I would not understand. I did not react. I waited patiently until my turn to speak. Then, I asked for the microphone and, in a calm tone, explained in English with my undisguised Latin accent, how the tax structure we had designed could save millions in unnecessary transfers. I used such clear arguments and such irrefutable numbers that, in the end, one of the Germans just shook his head in silence, defeated. There was no laughter, only the bitter recognition of someone who realizes that the sound of words matters less than the precision of the thought that underpins them. On the way back from that meeting, sitting in the airplane seat, I ordered a whiskey and stared at the reflection of my face in the darkness of the window. I had aged. My hair was already showing gray strands, and small wrinkles were deepening around my eyes. But my voice was the same. It still carried the raspy timbre that, so many years ago, had sparked laughter in a crowded room. I thought about how many lives had been impacted by the almost pathological need I had had to prove a point. How many businesses had been turned upside down? How many shareholders had lost fortunes? How many employees had been fired in processes that I myself had orchestrated to consolidate our power? All because, one day, a group of powerful men decided to laugh at the way I pronounced certain vowels. I felt no guilt, nor pride. I simply accepted the weight of the path I had chosen, a path that did not allow for sentimental revisionism. I was what I became, a direct result of those laughs, a predator who rose not to devour the innocent, but to ensure that no one would ever dare laugh at my voice again. When the plane landed in Brazil, I picked up my cell phone and there were dozens of messages waiting. Urgent matters, merger proposals, rumors about struggling competitors. I sighed, put the phone in my pocket and decided that for a few hours I would let the world burn without me. I left the airport without an entourage, got into a regular taxi, and asked for a ride to the coast. I needed to see the sea. When I arrived, I walked along a nearly deserted stretch of sand, listening to the continuous sound of the waves. There, alone, I spoke out loud, testing the weight of my accent against the wind, as if challenging the universe to mock me once more. No laughter came. Only the sea, indifferent, continuing its jolt back and forth, as if it wanted to remind me that all human struggles, no matter how great they may seem, are nothing more than small ripples in the immense course of time. Continue to the next paragraph. The salty breeze on that morning on the coast carried with it something that disarmed me in a way that the greatest corporate threats never could. I remained there for long minutes, my feet sinking into the damp sand, while the rhythmic sound of the waves seemed to dictate a breathing that was not only mine, but of an entire world that remained indifferent to the contracts I had torn up, the fortunes I had helped build and destroy, the empires that silently bent their knees before the strategy of a man who spoke with an accent too strong for certain ears. I then remembered an old conversation with my father, when I was still a teenager, when I told him I wanted to work in business, without even understanding what that meant. He, a simple man from the countryside, just shook his head and warned me that the world of the rich was no place for those who spoke like us. For a long time, that sounded to me like a fatalistic sentence, a mediocre prophecy of someone who had never dared to leave his place. Little did I know that, later on, I would understand the cruel weight of that observation, not because it was an insurmountable obstacle, but precisely because it was real, tangible, present in every suppressed laugh, in every look of disdain, in every micro-expression that was thrown at me since the first international corporate event I set foot in. As the sea advanced and receded, I felt a pang of bitter gratitude for all those who once found my way of speaking amusing. Without them, I might now be just another hard-working manager, stuck in a middle management position, adapting my voice to sound acceptable, cutting off my origins like someone pruning off troublesome branches. It was their mockery that pushed me to the limit of discipline, of relentless vigilance, of the almost unhealthy desire to master the rules of the game to the point of being able to rewrite them. I paid dearly for it. I lost ties that might have given me another form of comfort. I abandoned family celebrations, important dates, sincere loves that could not withstand the priority I gave to reports and the phone calls that arrived at absurd hours. Each of these sacrifices took root within me, shaping a man that many feared, some admired, and very few really knew. Now, standing on that seashore, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to convince myself otherwise, I was still driven by a primitive instinct to ensure that no one would ever again expose me to ridicule for being who I am. After that day, I returned to São Paulo with a lighter body, but my mind filled with new concerns. I began to review my schedules, delegating tasks that I had previously monopolized out of sheer fear of losing control. I began to authorize directors who I had previously kept under a strict suspicion to carry out entire projects without my direct supervision. At first, this made me tense, almost sick, as if a single mistake on their part could compromise the wall I had built against past mockery. But, little by little, I began to understand that my empire no longer depended exclusively on the weight of my hand. The respect or fear, in many cases that my name inspired, was already so consolidated that all I had to do was show interest for entire structures to reorganize themselves. I didn't have to give up my vigilant nature. But for the first time I felt that I could take a few steps back without everything falling apart. This realization brought a strange, almost uncomfortable freedom, because although it was no longer necessary to always be on a war footing, there was still the emptiness of what to do with so much inner space. I then began to invest time in things that for decades I had considered irrelevant. I accepted invitations to speak at small universities, where insecure young people approached me with questions that reminded me of the young man I once was, eager to find signs that it was possible to exist in that market without having to shed my skin. I participated in mentoring programs, not the official ones, full of spotlights and ready-made speeches, but private meetings, where I spoke without filter about failures, betrayals, and the real weight of power. Many were shocked, perhaps expecting motivational lessons or easy recipes to replicate my success, and they became visibly uncomfortable when I described how fear can be as powerful a fuel as any ambition. Even so, they always ended up thanking me. Some sent me messages months later saying that they had decided to keep their accents, or that they had stopped trying to force a foreign posture in meetings just to fit in. Small victories that didn't make headlines, but that silently undermined the structural prejudice that once crushed me. There was also a moment, almost clandestine, that left a deeper impression on me than any merger or acquisition. During a low-key event in Santiago, Chile, I was approached by a young analyst, the daughter of highland peasants, who told me in halting Spanish that I was living proof that you don't have to hide who you are in order to thrive among giants. She spoke with a flushed face, sweating, stumbling over her words. But there was so much truth in her nervousness that I felt something break inside me. I thanked her, touched her arm lightly, and told her never to let anyone convince her to polish her roots. Afterwards, as she walked away with a shy smile, I realized that that small interaction carried a value that no valuation report could quantify. Because if my entire bloody journey had served to allow people like her to feel empowered to exist without shame, then part of the burden began to make sense. Still, the shadows never completely disappeared. I continued to lead operations in various regions of the globe, facing hostile boards, neutralizing the dirty strategies of competitors, imposing contracts that few would dare to challenge. When the market was throbbing with rumors of crises, there I was, anticipating moves, cutting costs, redesigning portfolios before the tide turned. I did this not out of kindness, nor out of a sense of corporate justice, but because the game demanded it and because my instincts would not allow me to relax. Whenever I closed a particularly tough negotiation, I remembered the salon in Manhattan, the director with the gold pin, the muffled laughter. And I was certain that all of that, each signed number, was one more brick in the wall that separated me from that past. One night, sitting alone in my office, revisiting old contracts out of habit, I realized something almost cruel. Even after everything, I still spoke the same way. Even with pronunciation courses paid for by companies, with training for international presentations, with decades of moving around world leaders, my accent remained intact, almost rude to the less accustomed ears. For a long time, I saw it as a scar, a painful mark left by the insults I had to swallow. Now, I was beginning to understand that it was precisely this scar that kept alive the memory of why I had done everything I did. Without it, I might have completely lost myself in the carpeted halls where the neutral tone is king and difference is the subject of subtle jokes. I closed the laptop, rested my face in my hands, and remained like that for long minutes, listening only to my own breathing. When I finally stood up, I felt the familiar weight on my back. But something about it sounded less oppressive, almost dignified. After all, carrying the burden of having transformed mockery into brute force, pain into a strategic engine, was no small feat.